important to keep everybody in our community as safe as possible, many countries across the world have put in measures which disproportionately inhibit religious freedom, including, in many cases, a total blanket ban on worship. Now, this was the case only recently over the summer months in Uganda, when for 96 days, all citizens were forbidden to access the hope that a church can provide in a time of widespread concern and uncertainty. And even now, after the ban, there are still stringent, disproportionate measures which make public worship very difficult to partake in, despite markets and other places being able to open with less difficulty. These are issues that are of concern to ADF International, who I have the pleasure of working for here in Austria at our headquarters, because at the core of our mission, we seek to keep the doors open for the gospel worldwide. But we could never have known how literally that mission was going to take us in the last few years. Now, as we begin, let me take you on a bit of a story as to how I personally, through ADF International, got to become aware of these religious freedom concerns. For us over here in Europe, with ADF International, it started in Scotland, my home country. When this pandemic hit in April 2020, churches were immediately targeted and shut down. At first, many churches even volunteered to do so. They said the government had to have time to understand what was going on. But as the months progressed and time passed and new research came to light, which showed that churches were no more dangerous than a supermarket or any other place that was open, including a bicycle shop or even an alcohol store, still they were not allowed to open. The worship ban was clearly disproportionate. The fact that businesses could open but churches not, despite not causing more risk to other places and despite them being willing to take precautions, show that the government did not value protecting religious freedom as they were obliged to under international law. That's when we met Canon Tom White from one of the most deprived areas of the UK, and he knew that it was so important for his flock, which knew about suffering already, to be able to have a source of hope in a world of uncertainty. Canon Tom knew that physical health is extremely important, but so is a person's mental and spiritual health, and that was being neglected. We at ADF International supported Canon Tom in building a compelling legal case to take to the highest civil court in his country. Our website was flooded with messages of support from people across Scotland, and as the case built, we saw more and more people come to realize that unnecessarily and disproportionately restricting religious freedom was wrong. Freedom to worship in public and in community is a fundamental human right. And so, good news, the judge heard the case in Scotland, agreed with the arguments, and Canon Tom, who stood alongside 27 other faith leaders, won. The judge declared a blanket ban on worship to be unlawful in a very strong judgment. Church doors swung open the next day. And around this time, we were starting to act in more and more similar situations across the world. The very next day, we were able to use the same arguments from Scotland in a case in Chile, and church doors were able to swing open there too. Not long later, we had great news from our legal team in Geneva in Switzerland, where they had supported a doctor and a group of mixed faith leaders, not unlike the case in Uganda, to successfully overturn an unjust worship ban there. But unfortunately, as we know, in some countries, these bans have not yet been declared unlawful. And here we are now in Uganda. Fortunately, some brave members of the community amongst us today have decided that religious freedom is a fundamental right that must be protected, and have boldly taken a challenge to the ban and the disproportionate burdensome restrictions on churches to not one, but three different courts. ADF International are hoping to see the same success across the world achieved in showing the court in Uganda and in East Africa that freedom of religion is a fundamental human right worthy of highest respect and protection. And that's what brings us here today with this phenomenal panel of experts from around the world. Today we are joined by Anne Tendo, who is a representative from Chronology, company legal advisors in Kampala. And I'm excited to hear from her about the legal situation on the ground in Uganda and what it's been like throughout the pandemic, over the summer during the 96 worship ban, and even since then about the strict procedures that churches have had to comply with over and above other places. We're also joined by my colleague in Washington, D.C., Sean Nelson, who has been actively involved in supporting this case from an international legalist perspective. And he's going to be able to talk to us about the human rights elements of this case. We're further joined by Dr. Eva Musiga, who is a pharmacist and a commentator in Uganda on this problem of religious freedom and the pandemic. And finally, we have a recorded video statement from Canon Tom White from Scotland, who was the bold priest who took his challenge forward, and he wanted to leave a note of encouragement to those in Uganda who are boldly taking their challenge forward to stand up for religious freedom and make sure such a ban is never imposed again. So I'm excited to hear from all these panelists. Some house rules perhaps to start the webinar off. This topic is one that is multidimensional, and there is numerous controversial and even emotional elements attached to discussing pandemic measures. And we could be here for hours and hours if we were to discuss and debate every element of vaccine politics and economic impact. But unfortunately, we have only 40 minutes to discuss. And so we want to make sure this webinar is focused on the religious freedom element of these pandemic measures. So we want to just hone our conversation in on how this is impacting churches, synagogues, mosques, places of worship. And we don't want to go too off track going into all the other elements of the ways that the pandemic affects our lives. So I encourage the panel to really focus their remarks on that. And we, secondly, would love to invite questions as well. So please, if you feel you have a question you'd like to pose, put it in the chat and we will have a look at that. Now, before I turn over to the live panel, I think it would be great to start off our time together with a note of encouragement. So I think we have a video ready to play from Canon Tom White. Is that correct? Let's see. Oh, okay, it looks like we are still waiting for that one. So let's kick off on live and we'll see what we can do in the meantime to hear from Canon Tom. Okay, well, let me turn firstly then to Anne Tendo, who joins us from Chronology. It's great to have you here with us, Anne. Is your video on, Anne? Great to see you there. Welcome and thank you for being part of this webinar today. Now, Anne, as a lawyer and as a Ugandan citizen yourself, can you, especially thinking of our international viewers of this webinar who might not be familiar with what's going on, can you really talk us through what the situation has been like from when the pandemic hit in April 2020 to now? What has the situation been like for the church?
Thank you very much, Lois, and thank you, ADF, for hosting this. The situation in Uganda has not been a good one for the church or for any religion during the pandemic. We first realized the aspects of the lockdown in Uganda in March 2020 when we registered the initial case, and towards the end of March there was a ban on all public gatherings, and public gatherings at the time included church gatherings. And so what happened after that was people could go to work, people could access any other place, but they couldn't hold weddings, they couldn't hold mass or church service, and that was just the beginning. Over the course of time, because we had been told they wanted to study the situation, a total lockdown was enforced, and this time around every aspect of life in Uganda was affected. And so it meant that we still couldn't gather to pray, regardless of the fact that religion plays a very central role in the lives of very many people, in the lives of Ugandans, so to say, as far as health is concerned, general public health, mental health, all that was put aside, and there was a total lockdown. Eventually, in around July, the lockdown was lifted and life started getting back to normal, but on the basis that standard operating procedures ought to have been followed. Unfortunately, churches and other places of worship were not opened. The president deferred the reopening of places of worship pending consultation with what we know as the Interreligious Council in Uganda, which is a body that has some religious leaders that really consult with the president, but do not necessarily represent everyone in Uganda or every religion in Uganda, but they do have the ear of the president. So what happened after the consultation is 2 months later, places of worship were opened with very stringent measures in place. Only 200 persons were allowed to gather in any place of worship, and there is no rationale behind the 200 cap on gathering. And then young children below the age of 12 and elderly persons were not allowed to congregate in places of worship. We still do not have a scientific basis for this rationale. So actually the president in his speech kept on saying that places of worship are super spreaders, and we still do not have scientific basis from the scientists that advise the president to show that places of worship are super spreaders. You know, a person right now, I can go downtown, which is extremely crowded. I can go downtown with a kid and I will not be kicked out, but I cannot go with a kid to church. I cannot go with an elderly person to church, which is hypocritical, so to say, but also disproportionate in the way it is being implemented in Uganda. Also, people with what they termed as underlying conditions or any kind of illness that is manifest were not allowed to access church, regardless of whether it formed a symptom of COVID or not. And so that has been the situation that is on and off. In Uganda this year, in 2021, we experienced what they termed as a second wave. And so we had lockdown in phases, 42 days and another 42 days, minimal, and then another total lockdown, with just essential workers allowed to access places. And again, freedom of religion was not regarded as essential. Actually, we were not allowed to gather anymore in places of worship. Even the 200 people were not allowed to gather at all. So we were back in what was like a total lockdown in regards to religious freedoms. And then eventually, after the 42 days and the extension of 42 days, the president eventually opened other places, but places of worship initially were ignored until after 60 days, where he came back and instituted the previous stringent measures. That means that we are back to worshiping, where we have only 200 people gathering without any basis to define why those 200 people. Children are still not allowed to attend places of worship. Elderly persons are still not allowed, and even sick people. So what has happened over the course of all that has been happening is we've had different legal teams and different religious leaders that have arisen across different religions, actually, to defy what is going on. And so we've had cases that have been filed in Uganda's High Court, in the East African Court of Justice, and in Uganda's Constitutional Court. To challenge the measures that have been instituted in place. There was total disregard for what the holding capacity of different places of worship could be, in as far as determining how many people could congregate in a place at a time. And we believe that there was discrimination in as far as barring children below the age of 12 and elderly persons from accessing places of worship. I may not go into the details of everything because of the sub judice rule, but those are some of the bases on which the measures are being challenged at the moment. However, there's a slow pace that is being used by the judiciary at the moment. The unfortunate thing is, in Uganda, they usually use the excuse of case backlog to delay hearing of cases or to frustrate petitioners and litigants. So that is what we are experiencing in some of the cases that have been filed. And so some of the hearing dates are really far away. And the other challenge that we're experiencing is some of the worshippers are complacent, you know, because some of them are able to congregate, some of them fall within the ambit of 200 people. So most of them are complacent, and the larger gatherings are actually suffering because they are not able to gather. 200 is less than you know, it's less than a portion of some of the gatherings that we can host here in Uganda for some fellowships, for some churches. So the larger gatherings are unable to meet, the smaller gatherings are able to meet, and so it's kind of frustrating the other people. That's what I can say for now, Lois.
That's very helpful. Thank you for that run through of some of the measures. And what I really took from what you said, Anne, is that there seems to be a difference between the way that some the churches and other places of worship are treated, and the way that other maybe secular businesses and places of commerce are treated. There seems to be different standards and different loopholes. Sean, let me turn to you now. Is that something, as somebody with experience and expertise as in international human rights law, is that disparity, how does international human rights law deal with that difference in treatment between the religious community and perhaps others?
Sure, thanks, Lois, and just want to thank everybody for folks from Uganda just for the invite for us to be part of this and to join on these really important issues. And I think it's you know, Anne gave a very thorough and good explanation of what's been happening on the ground in Uganda over the past few years, what happened over the summer, and then some of the legal cases that have happened in response to the church closures and the issues of discrimination. And you asked a very good question about, you know, the base question is discrimination against religious people or based on religion or belief permitted under international law? And the answer is very simply no, right? That's not permitted. There are very, very narrow circumstances that you might have some issues with that, but certainly not in any circumstance where you can say, oh, it's okay to shut down churches. You can't go to church, you can't go to a mosque, you can't go to a synagogue, you can't go to whatever form of worship that you and your conscience want to choose to go to, but you can go to the local business, you can go ride on the local public bus, you can do anything else in your life, but that one thing you can't do. And when you have that sort of a discrimination, it really raises your immediate suspicions about why is it that we're not allowed to go to church, but we are allowed to go buy you know, whatever the latest kind of trendy clothes are or something like that. And Anne really hit it very clearly, I think, which was that a lot of governments around the world, not just in Uganda, this is something that's I think a very concerning trend that we saw around the world. Governments started separating things into essential and non-essential categories, right? These were the things you needed to live, and over here were the things that, well, you could get along without doing. And strangely enough, many of our government betters decided that going to church and worshiping God, worshiping in community, that was not really an essential thing. And I think it just shows the disconnect from a lot of people who are enforcing these laws and enforcing these rules, and who do not know the preeminent space that freedom of religion has in international human rights documents, in just basic human rights that all of us know, right? That we know that being able to worship God is really one of the most fundamental things that we can do, and that's absolutely essential to what it is to be a human being, to have that connection to the divine, to the spiritual, that connection in community with others, that's something that provides not just, you know, any number of benefits in terms of, you know, the spiritual strength or or that sort of thing, but that a lot of people consider really a duty to do. You know, I'm Catholic and consider it a duty to go and worship God. So this is something that was really a very strange and I'd say almost fundamental divide that a lot of governments seem to think that church is not essential. That kind of view wouldn't have made sense for millennia. And in fact, if you look at human rights documents like the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, you find right there Article 18 in the ICCPR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, that everybody has a right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. When you look at the commentary that the Human Rights Council of the United Nations has talked about, it's very, very limited circumstances where you are able to restrict those rights because that's considered such a fundamental right. And I think most people consider the most notable aspect of religion is worshiping, right? Worshiping in community. Certainly there's some religions that might not be as primary of an aspect. When people think of, religion, they think of a church, they think of mosque, they think of people gathering together to worship God. So this is really a core, one of the most core values and core rights that we have, and not something that governments can just take away. And so, and in fact, in the ICCPR and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, freedom of religion is considered this is a complicated word, but a non-derogable right, which means even in times of emergency, that is one of the few rights. There's a whole list of them, just, it's a lengthy document. And there's only a few rights that are considered non-derogable, which means even when there is an emergency, you can't ignore it, you can't get rid of it. It is something so core, and freedom of religion is explicitly named as one of those. And that's how important people who had gathered in the wake of World War II, when they were doing the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the UDHR, that's how important everybody thought this. And these were representatives from all of the governments all over the world, and that's enshrined there. And that's not something that can just be done away with on a whim. And so what are the specific, the limited standards by which you might be able to restrict religious practice or things like that? And so when we're talking about those restrictions, we're talking about what's known as the external forum, but things that you do, right? Nobody is allowed to coerce you, to tell you, you have to believe this, you have to think this particular thing. You're not allowed to think that thought. You're not allowed to believe this certain thing. Nobody can do that. That's an absolute bar. But when it comes to actions that might happen out in public or out in the world, there can sometimes be legitimate restrictions. And Lois, you had mentioned at the beginning, that everybody is concerned for safety. This was something, I think back to March 2020, it feels just like yesterday when, the world seemed to change all of a sudden over just a few weeks. And people were really, really frightened and really scared. But it's now been a year and almost a year and 3/4 now since then, or 2 years for some folks. And we've certainly learned a lot about COVID, a lot about the ability to safely gather and things like that. But even in times where things are scary and difficult, we still have to follow law, right? We still have to follow those principles that we've set down through generations, because if we start getting away from that, we don't know where we're going to end up. And I think you're starting to see, there's a new variant or something, and you're seeing a lot of governments react very strongly and fearfully in that way. And I think you saw that at the very beginning, that there wasn't a principled action. So what are the things why people might restrict various things? So the standard is that you need something that has to be necessary, a necessary response, that's proportionate to whatever the danger is. It has to be for a legitimate purpose, and those are specifically enumerated. And it has to be non-discriminatory. Those are the basic standards. And I think that when it comes to complete church bans, and when it comes to a lot of the issues that are in the standard operating procedures that we see here and that we've seen all around the world, a lot of these things do not fit those tests, right? So the one that it does fit, I think, is for a legitimate purpose, right? A lot of health and safety, that's a pretty straightforward, legitimate purpose to consider. So people, you might be suspicious about some motives, but that seems like a legitimate purpose. But when you look at necessary and proportionate, that's where you really begin to wonder, are all these things right? So just as a prima facie case, when you're talking about potentially allowing various other kinds of activities, going to grocery stores or things like that, what government's deemed essential services, but then shutting down church, your question is, why is it necessary to shut down church, but not the grocery services or something like that? And when it comes to that word necessary, the test is that it has to be the least intrusive means possible, right? So what is the least thing that you can do to limit these issues? And if you're allowing other sorts of activity that also involves multiple people walking through, congregating, all of that kind of stuff, then why is it necessary to shut down one area and not another? And so that's an area where I think you see it fail there. Same thing with proportionate or disproportionate responses, right? Some of the SOPs have masks or have some social distancing requirements or just kind of basic things in some of the SOPs, and the question is, why hasn't that been there? And then on the non-discriminatory area, I think you've seen a lot of issues. Some are continuing. There's concerns about discriminatory enforcement of SOPs, that churches, mosques, houses of worship in general are being monitored, and that these are being enforced more against them and not against other businesses. You have the fact that they were shut down for 2 months longer than other places. So you have a lot of issues there under international law, and these are pretty common sense things. But I know I've spoken quite a bit, so I'll throw it back to you.
That's great, Sean. Thank you for that comprehensive overview of international human rights law that can sometimes seem so distant and difficult to understand, but you made that very clear that fundamentally religious freedom must be protected, and it's not something that can simply just be ignored or tossed aside, especially not in a time of emergency, because that's why we create these laws, is to guide us when we do face times of emergency. So that was very clear. Thank you for that. Dr. Eva, I would love to bring you in at this point, and thank you so much for joining us with your medical background and your expertise. And I know you've been speaking out in the media quite a bit about religious freedom in the pandemic. So I would love to hear your take on this. Sean mentioned in his remarks about the fact that we're not just looking to protect people's physical health during a pandemic, but also their mental and spiritual health. And I'd love to hear your perspective as someone who works in medicine, in the medical industry. What is your take on that? And perhaps you can take us into some of the current measures today. And politics aside, whether we agree with this treatment or that treatment, what is the effect right now of these measures on the church?
Thank you so much, Lois and Sean. It's a pleasure to be here, and I think we have some very productive dialogue going on here. As my colleague Anne has already shared, as concerning the chronology of events in Uganda since we had the first and the second, in quotes, waves of COVID-19 infection, there's been, as a medical worker and as a frontliner, I have interfaced a lot with patients, people who are actually infected and people who are looking to prevent getting infected with the virus in the setting of a community pharmacy that is outpatient, as opposed to the inpatient where you have clinicians and within the clinical hospital settings. So during my practice in that time, we did realize that in the first wave, we did not handle that many cases of the viral infections. That was in 2020. But in 2021, as Anne has shared, we did have a considerable number of cases. However, the outpatient experience in the community pharmacy setting gave us the opportunity to observe what therapeutic agents are available locally and which are affordable, accessible to a number of people, and have a good an acceptable safety profile to be used in children, basically in all ranges of ages, from children to the geriatrics. These are the people who are above 60 and above, whether or not they have a comorbidity, whether they have hypertension, whether they have diabetes and other conditions underlying that. And I was what was termed an essential worker. So I did get to interface with people who also had the ability to move around during that time, who are also, in quotes, essential workers, and also people who just had access to the pharmacy. So we did identify quite a number of therapeutic agents, some of which were prescribed by the Ministry of Health within Uganda as a battery of minimum drugs that could be used to treat and manage COVID-19 infections within the home. So we had drugs like azithromycin, vitamin C, zinc, use of steroids such as dexamethasone, methylprednisolone, prednisolone, etc. But being in the tropics, we also do have access to ivermectin, 12 milligrams. Here, we use it for treatment of schistosomiasis or river blindness, filariasis, and a few other conditions which are not really well known or native to the temperate regions. So because of that, we had the logistical advantage of access, and we did put this to use during the time when there was spells of shortage of key medicines such as azithromycin in the market. And we did register a really, really good report and a very good response towards most of these. So one, we did identify that there are therapeutic agents that can be used for both treatment and prevention of COVID-19 infection. That was very encouraging. Secondly, concerning the standard operating procedures and the caps and the other measures that have been taken with regard to the places of worship, it brought into question how well we are managing this medical emergency, because COVID-19 is not per se a military threat. It is it's an emergency of medical nature. So definitely the management of this would have to drift towards the basics of biomedical ethics. And that brings into question the Hippocratic Oath, which is something that I am bound by to preserve life and not to harm. Now, as a basic tenet of the Hippocratic Oath, it's something that took us also by surprise, because unlike so many other fields such as finances and economics and politics and so many other fields, the Hippocratic Oath and medical science gains its legitimacy to operate and handle emergencies prior to COVID-19 and even COVID-19 from its acknowledgement and submission to divinity. Yeah, whatever that is for different people, whether it is Muslims or Christians or whatever it may be, the Hippocratic Oath and medical science basically gets its legitimacy from its acknowledgement and submission or respect of other people's understanding and concept of divinity or of the divine, which means that whatever measures were taken during that time, whether it was therapeutic agents, whether it was preventative measures such as vaccination, SOPs, closure of places of worship, had to take into account respect for the concept of divinity. And unfortunately, when we saw that that was not respected, so many questions came into play, even for us in the medical profession across the field, whether it was pharmacists and doctors, because Uganda is a very religious nation. We have 98%, or probably a very significant portion of people have subscribing to or being part of a religious system. So when we looked at this analytically, when I looked at it as a medical worker, there was the question of why this was not being respected. Why were people's belief systems were not being respected? In basic medical training, we were told that if, for example, somebody did not want, let's say, a blood transfusion and they were on their deathbed, you know, like somebody's belief systems did not allow them to receive a blood transfusion, or maybe, let's say, in some religions, there's a treatment, let's say insulin, that is derived from an animal that may be considered unclean, yeah, they have the right to absolutely say, no, I'd rather take my chances even if it's unto death. But this time around, that was not really the case at play, because right now, alongside when we put alongside the therapeutic agents, the other measures that are being taken on, including the vaccinations, there's a lot of people have religious reasons as to why they would like to choose one over the other, but there seems to be more emphasis on one over the other, and not giving room for middle ground and really for debate or for inquiry, and that is something that is very unfortunate. So the SOPs and the capping and even the notion that churches are super spreaders, when academically looked into at the studies that are available to the scientific community worldwide, there's no studies really that show that masks, for example, except for the N95 mask, can filter out the virus because of the particulate size of the virion of COVID-19. Yes, so that already is something that still raises a lot of questions about how efficacious some of these SOPs are. You know, the issue of hand washing, that is a simple hygiene issue. I believe that's available in most places of worship, but the regulation and the follow-up, and you know, there is no scientific study backing up that 200 people in a place of worship is just like Anne, my colleague, said, there is no study behind that giving quantities or demographics or a maximum number of people beyond which you will not have, you know, the virus spreading. It's something that I think was drawn from logic, but it's not backed up by academic study. It's not backed up by any research done and journaled in a peer-reviewed article. You know, it's not available. So we're asking a lot of questions, and we'd like to know, just like Anne said, where this information is gotten from. Lastly, on the issue of measures that are being taken and that are affecting the places of worship, in Uganda today, we have a drive, a governmental drive to encourage vaccination with the novel COVID-19 vaccines. And most of these vaccination exercises are being done within places of worship. Okay, and there's mixed feelings about this, because when this initially came up, when the measures came up and places of worship were closed, the Interreligious Council was approached. But somehow the Ministry of Health within Uganda also came into play, and we began to see places of worship, churches, being used as centers to rally and basically use the trust that people have in places of worship to obtain a vaccination and documentation thereafter. And I feel that is something that places of worship are sacrosanct. There's when we look at aseptic methods in medicine, how aseptic and how suitable places of worship are for administration of vaccination, there's a lot that is lacking, because in a community pharmacy, such as where I work, we are not allowed to even do the slightest invasive procedure, including measuring of blood sugar, which is just, you know, a finger prick, and then you apply that onto a test strip in a glucometer. We're not allowed to do rapid tests. We're not allowed to do any of that by the National Drug Authority, which is the regulatory authority for medicines. We're not allowed to do that, and we have trained and registered personnel that can be traced back to a professional fraternity. How about the places of worship? There seems to be a double standard there, and also we need to put into context that some of these procedures, that they have different implications in different geographical locations. If you have a vaccination exercise or anything that involves blood done within a clinical setting, that can be, that actually has a medical aspect to it. But within a place of worship, there may be a ritualistic aspect to that because of where it is being done. And that puts a lot of it brings in, it calls into question whether this is transgressing or trespassing into the prescribed ways of worship in these places of worship. Because in Christianity, we do believe that the blood of Jesus that was shed on the cross was abolished all forms of bloodletting procedures, let me put it that way, sacrifices. So anything to do with blood is really misplaced when it comes to houses of worship. But this has gone on, fallen onto deaf ears when religious leaders and people who have strong sentiments about their places of worship and the modes prescribed by whatever books they have, the Bible for Christians. When this kind of information comes up, it falls onto deaf ears. And unfortunately, we have the agenda still being, encouraged in the places of worship. Right. And I don't think that's ethical, but that is the situation that we have on ground at the moment.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Eva, for sharing that very interesting perspective from somebody who's been involved in the medical community. And I understand that you feel that the religious community has not been heard or perhaps listened to when these rules and regulations have been written. So perhaps only one side of the argument has been listened to, and there's not been adequate balance to make sure that all rights are respected and all people are taken into consideration. So thank you very much for sharing that. We have a few comments on the group chat from our audience and listeners, all very positive and encouraging. Elijah's wondering if places of worship are closed, who will pray for the current situation, and in these times only God will see us through. Somebody's asking if restrictions against religious gatherings are permitted in international law. Sean did a great job of explaining that one, so thank you, Sean. And Sunshine is asking who decides what is essential and what is not. She would rather decide that for herself. And that's a really important theme, is freedom of worship essential or not? That's been a real fundamental question in this. Either it is or it is not. And the government have to show that they do believe that it is. Now, we don't have long left, sadly, but perhaps we'll just take one quick turnaround, all of the panelists, to explain, maybe give something further that you want to make clear, but I want to hear also about your hopes for this case going forward. What are your hopes to see from the court when this case is heard? And yeah, that would be great. So Sean, why don't you kick us off? What are your hopes for this case being heard in these two courts?
So thank you, Lois, and again, thanks to everybody who's listening on or watching online, and to the other panelists. And I think it's really been an interesting discussion, a good discussion. And Lois, I think you're right. And just briefly responding that question about who gets to decide, what's essential and what's not essential, and kind of tie it into the hope. And I think that one thing that as this has gone on is that more people are raising their voices and ask questions of some of the decisions that various government leaders have made that have seemed unfair, or really have seemed to violate their rights. And you see this all around the world, that there are legal cases where people are bringing their claims before impartial judges, and many of them are succeeding, right? And in many of those cases, the government did go over the bounds that they should have. And without that public debate, without those comments, without individual churches, individual believers coming together and really making a statement, and saying, hey, this doesn't seem right, this seems too far. Without that wouldn't have happened, right? And so one of the things that I have real hope for is that more and more people are standing up and saying, I don't think that seems right. I think that's too far. I'd like to know what you're basing your decisions on. I'd like to know why you're treating worshipers worse than other groups or other houses of worship worse than other areas. And I think that the more the people do that, the more that they raise their voice and the more that they make their concerns known in forums like this, in just talking to their neighbors, all of those sorts of things, reaching out to politicians, that's going to have an effect. I think it had an effect even in the course of the last few months that because people raised their voices, churches did get reopened earlier than had been expected and than the president had said. And I think you do see that sort of pushback when people make a good case, because there's a good case to be made. Then you can get things to change. You can get them to change in a better spot. And so for the case going forward, I think what's really important to look for is that a precedent can be set saying you can't shut down houses of worship just because of a claimed emergency, right? You have to treat houses of worship, you have to treat believers fairly, you have to treat them consistently with your other regulations, and we're just not going to stop people from worshiping. We're not going to do it. And I think that's the important precedent that we need to set going forward. There's lots of other issues in there, but I think that's the most important one, and that would be important for Uganda, it would be important for East Africa, all of Africa, and it would really have a worldwide impact as well. Again, thanks to everybody. Thanks, Lois, for moderating.
Thank you, Sean. That's very encouraging, and it sounds like this case could really make a huge difference, not just for Uganda, but for further afield as well. Dr. Eva, do you share this hope just quickly as we finish? Are you also hopeful about the result of this case?
Absolutely. I am very hopeful, and I push and urge that medical practitioners everywhere would identify and stick within the boundaries of what we swore under oath to do to preserve life, but also respect and acknowledge and submit under the concept of divinity, and thereby not push medication and not push SOPs and all of these things against the will of people, and also not step into overreach into the places of worship, and as well as the vaccination aspect. Houses of worship are absolutely holy places. They are not meant to be used for medical procedures. It is unethical, and I'm hopeful that that will be taken into consideration and reversed. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Eva, and thank you for sharing your expertise. I think it's clear that we think that the public health and religious freedom don't have to be in conflict. We can achieve both effectively, and we can protect both, and that's what we hope the government will do. And please share with us your final thoughts. What are your hopes for this case, and what would the international community be able to do to support you?
Thank you, Lois. My hopes, first of all, is first of all for the community in Uganda to recognize that although historically we have had religious freedoms trampled on by different regimes over time, from time immemorial, we've had regimes that have not respected religious freedoms, and so people have built a conscience where, you know, we have a regime that kind of offers some kind of freedom, and then they believe that they're indebted to the regime. So my hope is that when the cases are heard, the courts will, you know, come to remind the people that religious freedoms, just like any other right, are inherent. They're not granted by the state. They are given to you from your point of birth, and you have every right to enjoy it the way that, you know, your conscience allows you to practice and manifest your religious freedom. And secondly, just like Sean mentioned, in Uganda, we don't really have very many cases. Actually, we really don't have cases that build on the right to freedom of worship. So from these cases, I expect that that jurisprudence will be built upon, and I hope that we'll have cases that establish that, you know, people have the right to exercise their freedom of worship, and without restriction. I hope that the court will agree with the different petitioners to unconditionally reopen places of worship and disband with the SOPs that have been put in place on places of worship that do not necessarily have any rationale whatsoever and any scientific backing whatsoever. And we do not even need science to dictate for us how we ought to worship actually, because freedom of worship is granted to us by our God, and we ought to worship the way we are supposed to worship. That is my hope for the cases. And from the international community, first of all, would like to thank ADF for the support that they have rendered through the town hall debates, through the different cases that have been instituted in court, and through different ways that they have worked with the different people that have played a key role in advocating for reinstitution of freedom of worship in Uganda during the COVID pandemic. And maybe from the international community, it's the kind of support that we would need is maybe to build publicity around what is happening in Uganda, the different ways that we are being oppressed in as far as exercise of our rights is concerned during this regime, during the pandemic. And a call to the government of Uganda to respect people's rights, people's freedoms during the pandemic, and not to use it as, you know, something that they can use to manipulate people into doing what they want them to do. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for sharing, and thank you for your dedication to this case and for your hard work in pushing it through and championing religious freedom. I think to close us off, we have, I think we have our video message prepared from Canon Tom White. Is that right? It should come up in any second. Here we are. Have we shared sound as well, perhaps? Let me see. Perhaps I can share it from mine and I can share sound as well. How's that? Okay. All right. Here we go. That's working now.
Dear brothers and sisters in the church in Uganda.
Still not. Oh, well, we'll have to send that video message around perhaps to those who were able to attend the panel today. Unfortunately, we weren't able to hear from Canon Tom this time, but hopefully we'll be able to share his message next time. All right, well, thanks to everybody who was able to participate in the panel today. It's been a real pleasure to be able to hear from these esteemed guests with so many different perspectives, but all championing religious freedom and with putting so much effort into this case that will hopefully set a precedent, not only for Uganda, but for East Africa and who knows where else. So thank you once again. It was great from hearing from you, and we are proud to support this case as ADF International. Thank you.